Hi. Okay, so I'm doing this under quite a bit of pressure right now, like time pressure. But I wanted to do this again because I wasn't that satisfied with the first time we did this. And by this, what I mean is this story, authored by Jacob Hanson in around 2010. So I would estimate in the age range of, I don't know, between 8 and 10, thereabouts. Okay, it was kind of written in stages. And again, this is the Jacob Hanson author support team that is talking to you right now. And I should just get to it right away. So let me go ahead and share the screen. One thing that I wasn't satisfied the first time around with was, there was an inconsistency. I thought that things were getting better once I started getting a little more into it. So that is a little more exaggerated than maybe I would have thought was cool when I first began. But so I'm gonna see if that works. So here we go. So here we go. This is the novel by the title of The Lunar Express by Jacob Hanson, presented here and recorded by his author support team. Let us begin with the dramatis personae. That's the list of people in the book. So we start off with S.C.I. George, or Cy George. A couple ways that you could pronounce this name. You could go Cy George, or you could go Cy George. And I'm going to go with Cy George on here. Cy George, inventor of the Lunar Express. Greg, the son of Cy George. Margaret, from Mantona, Montana, passenger of the Lunar Express. Lewis, ticket taker. Randolph, New York. Mr. Stein, mad scientist. Christina, the Lunar Express driver. George, Cy George's wife. Scruffy, Cy George's dog. Chapter 1. Cy George went upstairs to ask his wife Georgia if she knew where the book was. Sorry, but I have no clue where you left it, said Georgia. You what? You don't know where you left it? You got to be kidding me. He thought for a moment and said, maybe Greg took it somewhere. Greg was Cy George's son. He was in his room playing fetch with the dog Scruffy. Cy George ran to the room, opened the door, and hollered, Hey, Greg, do you have any idea where my big book is? Even before his son could answer, Cy George knew what the answer was when he looked in the room and saw bits and pieces of paper lying on the floor underneath the dog's mouth. The dog, with a shred of paper still hanging from one side of its mouth, looked up at Cy George and wagged his tail. And I'm not going to point out, as I did the first time around doing this recording, that tail is misspelled. Instead, Cy George opened his mouth but could not say a word. He wanted to cry. He turned around, hanging his head, and started to walk away. Hey, why the long face? Cy George responded, It's no good now. I'll never be able to build the Lunar Express. You mean the train that flies in space? Right. I've got the plans for it all up here in my head. Suddenly, Cy George stopped walking. Wait a second. Exactly who am I talking to? Me, buddy. Your old pal, Scruffy. Chapter 2. There, we're done. Cy George walked away from the Lunar Express, which sat downstairs and almost filled up the whole basement. Greg was walking downstairs. When he saw the Lunar Express, he almost fainted. The Lunar Express went up through the ceiling. Cy George had to cut a hole through the ceiling so that the space train could fit. It was a dark black, but its 15 windows were blue. It was magnificent, or at least Cy George thought so. Not so much Greg. He thought his mom would blame him for the hole in the ceiling, since usually Greg was the troublemaker, like the time he spilled grape juice on his mom's favorite t-shirt, or the time he got the dog Scruffy to play fetch with his dad's big book. The problem is, said Scruffy, who was sitting at the bottom of the steps, wagging his tail as usual, how are we going to get it through the small little door in our basement? I don't know, said Cy George. All I know is that I have a shrinking spray can that can shrink it, and then we can move it out. Cy George turned around and went into the cabinet against the wall, where he grabbed the can of shrinking spray. Then he walked back to the Lunar Express and sprayed the contents of the can on the walls of the space train. But a little bit of spray got on himself, as well as on Scruffy. There was a puff of smoke, also a tiny explosive sound. And the sound had died down, and the smoke had faded away. Cy George and Scruffy were standing in front of the Lunar Express, looking at each other in amazement because they saw that they were both now 3 inches tall. All of a sudden, a shadow fell on them. It became dark. They looked up and realized that Greg was just about to step on them, but luckily, Scruffy got a good hold of Greg's shoe with his teeth and tore a hole in the shoe. "Whew, that was close," said Cy George. At that point, Georgia walked downstairs. "Greg," she said, "what on earth is that on your shoe?" Just a little hole." "Just a little hole, Greg? Go to your room." "Besides, Greg, bad narrator. Back up. Just a little hole, Greg? Go to your room." "But it wasn't me, it was Scruffy." "Besides, Greg, where is Scruffy? He was shrunken 3 inches tall, and so was Dad." "Greg, what nonsense. You're grounded from TV for lying." But I wasn't lying." "Greg, seriously, go." Greg hung his head and walked off to his room without saying another word. In the meantime, Scruffy and Cy George were just sitting and looking up at Georgia. At that moment, Georgia recalled that Cy George had shrinking spray in his work cabinet. She realized that Greg must have got hold of it and shrunk her husband and the dog. She turned to the cabinet and grabbed the de-shrinking spray. She sprayed it on Cy George and the dog. After 3 seconds, the cloud of spray cleared, and she saw both of them standing in front of her, full-sized again. Chapter 3. Now that Cy George and Scruffy were back to normal size, they could bring out the Lunar Express, because it was still just 3 inches tall. Cy George picked it up. Cy George picked up the Lunar Express with his thumb and pointer finger. He brought it outside. Georgia still had the de-shrinking spray in her hand. She sprayed it on the Lunar Express. Now the space train was back to normal size. Greg came running downstairs from his room. Mom, there's a mouse in the house." "Greg, I don't care if there's a mouse in the house right now. I care about the Lunar Express. I want to ride in it right now, Greg." "Georgia," said Cy George, "we can't ride it yet. We still need passengers." "But there already are passengers, the 4 of us." "But that's not enough passengers," said Cy George. Georgia thought for a moment. "Yeah, maybe the 4 of us aren't enough, but there's just one thing I want to do. Fly to the people that we want to ask." "Sure, we can do that," said Cy George. "But one thing's first. We don't have seatbelts." "But then again, who cares? I built the Lunar Express to have super safety powers." The same thing as last time I read. There's a little kink in the narrative right there. Somehow I don't know, right? She presents a problem. Georgia presents a problem. Cy George admits that there's a problem. Sure, we can do that. We can go by. I don't know. It's not. That's okay. "Okay, sure, we can do that," said Cy George. "But one thing's first. We don't have seatbelts. But then again, who cares if we don't have seatbelts? I built the Lunar Express to have super safety powers." So the question is, why didn't Cy George bring up the super safety powers earlier as an inducement to everyone to get the heck in there? Okay? All right, well, we can go back and fix that up. The 4 of them hopped in the Lunar Express. Inside, there was a coffee table, a movie player, which had the most boring movies in the world, the only ones Dad liked, and a white table for playing cards. And also there was a steering wheel, of course. Cy George sat at the seat beside the steering wheel. He turned on the ignition. There was a rumbling sound. George, Greg, and Scruffy watched out of their windows as they lifted softly off the ground. "Whoa," they all whispered. "Cool. You having any fun?" asked Cy George from the pilot seats. "Are you kidding me?" said Scruffy. "We're having so much fun." "Good," replied Cy George. It was silent until they landed. They landed in Montana. They went up to the first house they saw. They knocked at the door. A little girl opened the door. "Hello," she said. "Who are you?" "Exactly who are you?" asked Cy George. "I am Margaret. Pleased to meet you. Margaret shook Cy George's hand. He asked her, would you like to be a passenger of the Lunar Express? What is the Lunar Express? If I moved out of your way, you would be able to see what the Lunar Express is. And Cy George stepped out of the way. Oh my gosh, said Margaret. She almost fainted. I'll go ask my mom if I can go. She stepped into the house very wobbly. 5 minutes later, she walked back out. She said, I can go. When am I going to get back, though? Whenever the power runs out. How long does the power last? About 2 years. 2 years, said Margaret. Do we have enough food? Yes, we do have enough food. And would you like to know what the food is? Yes, I would. Beetles and beetle eyes. Gross. Yeah, I know, said Cy George. Margaret walked into the Lunar Express, and they all took off. Chapter 4. What's really to eat? Where shall we take you, Margaret? Asked Cy George. I don't even know a specific place where we're going, answered Margaret. Why, we're going into space for 2 whole years. 2 years ain't that long. You're right, master, said Scruffy. I'm not sure about this, said Margaret, scratching her head. Oh, you'll be fine. Just take me back home. How high are we even in the sky? We haven't even taken off. In that case, then get me off of here. Okay, said Cy George, but you're going to miss out on a great adventure. Fine, Margaret said. There's just one thing I'm not sure about eating. Cy George said, the beetle and the beetle's eye. I was just kidding about that. Then what do you actually have? Cockroaches. Duh. Scruffy had fallen asleep in the middle of the conversation, which I gotta say is surprising because I wasn't about to fall asleep in the middle of that conversation about the cockroaches, the beetles, and so on. I actually thought it was a fairly puzzling conversation that kept my attention the whole time. So what is it about Scruffy that made him fall asleep? Margaret said, I really don't want to go on a space trip with a lackadaisical dog. Exactly. That dog was so lackadaisical. It couldn't even pay attention to the interesting conversation that Margaret was having with Cy George. Just come on, said Cy George. Let's get this show on the road. And before Margaret could even say anything, the Lunar Express was 5 feet off the ground. Finally, they landed in a suburban neighborhood in Houston, Texas, to pick up a new passenger. Cy George exited his spacecraft and walked up to what looked like a boy's house. Footballs and baseballs lying all over the lawn. Cy George walked up to the door and rapped on it. The door opened. A buck-toothed boy with overalls and straw hat looked at Cy George with a wince of curiosity. Howdy, partner. My name's Jimmy, and what do you want? I would like you to be a passenger on my space train. I gotta ask my mama first. He disappeared back inside. A couple of minutes later, the boy came rushing out saying, My mama said I could come. Then hop in, you Texas Longhorn. When everyone was settled in the space train, Cy George asked, do we need yet another passenger? He looked around and answered his own question. Heck, there's only 6 of us. Me, Scruffy, my son, my wife, Margaret, and Texas Longhorn. That's me, said Jimmy. Cy George said, we're going to get one more passenger, so get ready. Cy George landed his space train once again, this time in Rome, Italy. Cy George walked up to another person's house, an old apartment next to a pizza place. Cy George knocked on the apartment door. A boy about 16 stepped out. Ciao, come stai? Yes, I would love some pizza, but maybe later. Right now I have something else to tell you. Oh, you speak English. What I actually said was, hello, how are you? Cy George said, come outside, per favore. I've got something to show. I have something to show you. I have to ask my mamma first. He turned and yelled, Mamma, posso andare nello spazio? A voice from inside said, Sì, ma devi tornare per cena. Cy George asked, what's your name? The kid said, Enrico. George asked, What's that mean in English? Henry. Can I just call you Henry? No, il mio nome è Enrico. Va bene, ti chiamo Enrico. Wait a second, said Enrico. I thought that you didn't know Italiano. Cy George frowned. I don't. Whoa. Wow. That's just freaky. He looked for a second at Enrico, at the ship, then said, all right, let's go to the moon. Enrico turned back toward the door. Ciao mamma, ci vediamo a cena. Chapter 5, the final takeoff. Cy George and Enrico entered the ship. Enrico said, Chi sono questa gente? No, our mission is not to get a Sony TV. Actually, we don't have a mission at all. Enrico said, then why are we doing this? To see if this thing works. Enrico said, you don't know if this thing works? So you're saying we could crash at any time? Cy George nodded, yep. Enrico said, tu sei un cretino. Cy George said, why do you call me an idiot? Oh, now you understand Italiano. Cy George walked over to the steering wheel. He turned the ignition key, and off they went. You notice I'm speeding up here? This is because of the time pressure thing. They were traveling at the speed of 5 light years. In no time, they arrived on the moon. Once they arrived, Margaret asked, do you have any spacesuits? Cy George said, nope. Texas Longhorn said, you need spacesuits. Then he bent down and picked a small piece of paper from the floor. Everyone watch this and hold your breath. He then opened the door and threw the piece of paper out. It turned black and crumpled into pieces. Cy George said, that's a problem. Then he said, wait, I have a pack of balloons in my pocket. Everyone start blowing them up, but don't tie them into knots. Everyone looked at their fully inflated balloons. They're inflated balloons. Cy George said, now we can breathe the air in there. Enrico said, did anyone notice that closet that says spacesuits on it? Margaret, Georgia, Scruffy, Greg, and Texas Longhorn all said, now you tell us. They all went to the closet and each grabbed the spacesuit. One by one, they exited the ship. Mi sembra di volare, said Enrico. Texas Longhorn said, wow, look at me. I can jump 15 feet in the air. While Enrico, Texas Longhorn, Scruffy, Greg, Margaret, and Cy George all lunged forward away from the ship, excited that the moon's low gravitation let them act like birds and maybe gigantic frogs. Georgia, they noticed, stood still near the ship. What's the matter, Georgia? Shouted Cy George. She was staring at the horizon. Do you see something? Asked Texas Longhorn. Yes, she said. Look. They all turned the way she was facing, and far away was what seemed to be a gigantic frisbee with turbojets. Wow, a UFO, said Margaret. Everyone, said Cy George, back in the ship. Everyone did just as Cy George commanded, running back full speed to the ship's hatch. Everyone, that is, except Scruffy. Scruffy, come back here. What do you think you're doing? Those aliens ain't going to want to play fetch with you. Scruffy, who had selective hearing, continued running toward the horizon. They all saw a flash of light, but Scruffy was gone. The aliens had taken Scruffy away. Cy George said, everyone, get ready for a real adventure. Enrico said, pensavo che andare alla luna fosse un'avventura. Huh? Margaret said, Enrico said, I thought going to the moon was an adventure. Cy George looked suspiciously at Margaret. His left eyebrow raised very high. You know how to speak Italian too? Si. Cy George said, well, then tell Enrico that this is going to be an even bigger adventure. Margaret said, tell him yourself. He understands English just fine. You don't have to tell me, said he. You don't have to tell me, said Enrico. I'm standing right here. But what are we going to do exactly? We're going to go get Scruffy. Chapter 6, the adventure begins. Sorry, I'm looking something up on my phone right now. And I may have to do this last chapter at some other point. But just hang on to your shoes, if everyone in the listening audience. Hold on, I'm sorry here. Commencement ceremony at which Jacob Hanson is commencing. So let me see here. Yeah, divided attention. I may have to do a third recording here. So, but let me go here. Keep one eye here. Keep one eye on the commencement thing, which is Facebook thingamajig. The 5 adventurers set out with confidence to find their dear friend Scruffy. Remember, disappeared. We don't know what happened to Scruffy. I mean, his fate is one big question mark right now. What did the aliens do to Scruffy? With Cy George as its steering wheel and his wife Georgia and the three children bringing up the rear, Cy George heard someone crying and looked back to realize it was Texas Longhorn. "What's wrong?" said Cy George. "I don't want to get eaten." "You're not going to get eaten, I don't think." Cy George turned to his wife and whispered out of earshot of the others, "I'm sure the alien's first choice would be Longhorn. He doesn't do us any good anyways." Georgia said, with a higher pitch than was normal even for her, "Cy George, put that potty mouth away or I'm going to have to wash it out with soap." Yeah, I don't know if it's the time pressure or if it's the disappearance of Scruffy or what it is, but they're heading into some like derangement zone right here. I mean, things are looking bad on the ship. Cy George. So she said, "I'm going to have to wash it out with soap." Cy George said, "What flavor?" Georgia smacked Cy George across the face, knocking him away from the steering wheel. Cy George quickly rushed to the steering wheel and fought to get it back on course, making the Lunar Express bump up and down, shake and twist in spirals. When the dust settled, they realized that they had crashed onto a new planet. "See," said Georgia, "look what you did. We don't even know where we are." "Furfledoof," said Cy George, pointing to a tall sign. Now, okay, see, glad I did the second reading. Furfledoof, I thought the first time around was just one of those interjections, right? So you'd say like monkey nuggets or something like that, right? But no, Furfledoof is actually the name of the place they landed. Okay, "Furfledoof," said Cy George, pointing to a tall sign almost touching the nose of the Lunar Express. A sign lit up with beautiful lights, purple, pink, orange, and blue. It was made out of the rocks, the same rocks that covered the ground of the strange, colorful planet. Cy George turned left to see Texas Longhorn tucking his head into his knees, crying and saying, "I want to see my mama." "Oh, man, you little girl," said Cy George. Then Cy George felt a pain on his right cheek and noticed that Margaret had punched him. "Girls are not wimps," said Margaret. "When did he say they were wimps?" "He didn't even say they were whipped." "Okay, yeah, well, you know." Enrico said, "Voglio tornare a casa." Cy George said, "Why do you always talk in Italian when you could just speak English?" Everyone broke out in a raging, screaming, violent fight. That concludes this portion of the novel. It could comprise book one of a 3-book novel. Who's to say? But a little work to do. Maybe we'll do a third. Maybe we'll do a third recording. But for now, check out the dog.